Wicahpi, Chante Washtea, Nape Chiujapi, London for Thunder Hutcherson, and Machiapi. Hi everyone, my name is London for Thunder Hutcherson. I just introduced myself to you in my native language, and I would like to start this podcast off by greeting you all with a warm heart. In today's podcast, we have a guest from a Native American community who will share what sovereignty means to them and their communities. But let me start with a bit more context of this podcast, which is based on a digital history course focusing on oral histories. And as someone who comes from a culture whose entire livelihood is centered on oral histories, what better way to have open conversation on tribal sovereignty than with a indigenous community member? I'd also like to share the focus of this podcast, which is to gather an understanding of what sovereignty means to indigenous community members personally, for the community, and for future generations. My wonderful guests will share their thoughts on the intricacies of sovereignty from their point of view with some guiding questions from me. Without further ado, let's learn what our guest thinks about sovereignty.
My name is Wicahpi, Chaddlesone, Yankton, and I graduated from Bridgewater State University with a degree in political science, international affairs, and a minor in English and integrated communication. And I am a enrolled member of the Glossy Tribe.
Thank you for introducing yourself. So, as you know, this podcast is we're going to be talking about sovereignty and what it means to you as a community member, and in your life journey. And so, we're going to go through some questions. But first, I'd like to give a federal definition of sovereignty for those who don't know what it is, which is through the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. Basically states that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among several states and with Indian tribes. And so nowadays, federal courts have interpreted that to mean that while tribes have the right to self-government, that their sovereignty is subject to be overridden or removed by the federal authority. And so, with that understanding and definition, I want to ask what sovereignty means to you based on that definition.
So, growing up, the definition of tribal sovereignty was taught to us. I think since the probably fifth grade. That's when we started learning about it. Not gonna lie. Well, I grew up on the reservation and we didn't have the typical American government class. It was all about learn your own treaties, the history of the government, and with a lot of Native American tribes. So sovereignty to me is a tribe being able to decide on its own how to create laws, committees, bylaws, how to support their members, protect their members, law enforcement, even control how many casinos they want to have or any other businesses that include their revenue. And so sovereignty as a whole is up to a lot of indigenous communities to decide on their power. And it also means the government does not have really much influence over the tribe when it comes to those decisions, maybe when it comes to funding and budgeting reasons, but other than that, that's what sovereignty means.
Well, you already answered the first encounter a little bit, but I just want to know, like, as a kid growing up on the reservation, hearing about sovereignty from a tribal perspective, from family members, or, as you said, within your reservation education, has anything changed since entering higher education, through college? And, yeah.
So, I always heard about sovereignty growing up because my mom, way back in the day, was on the OST Constitution revival, which means that they wanted to update our constitution and our bylaws and also help define a lot of what sovereignty is and within our constitution. And so I kind of knew what the word was growing up a little bit, but I would say that it has changed. Like example is like how all the reservations band together to ban the former governor, Christine Nome. That was like one modern example of using tribal sovereignty and also denying any support from her as well. That's also another example. So sovereignty has always been like slowly evolving um, through the years. When it comes to government stuff, tribal government, it may take a while, but modern examples, like I mentioned before, it's slowly popping up. So yeah.
And then in your journey through academia, how has sovereignty informed your learning and how you approach topics concerning Native American past, present, and future?
So, being the only Native American student as a political science department as a whole, there was like only maybe like 100 students every year. It's probably like still the same students, but being one of the few Native, well, probably the only Native, I had to educate a lot of professors on what sometary was, or I would get those looks because I'm the one that sits in the back of the classroom, not really paying attention to class, but like listening here and there. I would always get the like point towards the teacher being like, can you talk about what tribal sovereignty is? Or like, how would you bring this as a native perspective? And so not a lot of political science majors really know what tribal sovereignty is. They kind of see it as like an international politics sovereignty, but little do they know, it does exist within the United States, especially on a lot of tribes. So that's one thing I always was found interesting about was tribal sovereignty was not really mentioned, especially in political science courses. Even though it's an interesting topic, and the only time you would probably ever hear about it is through like if you're doing a Native American history course, Native American English course, you name it, anything Native American history, that's probably when you're going to hear it. And so I was kind of shocked as a political science major that tribal sovereignty was not really mentioned, especially to those who have concentrations in American government. I think it's very important for those students to learn about tribal sovereignty, especially if they're going to become lawyers or work in the government as a whole. So I think it's not really well taught, especially with campuses that have small native student population too. I feel like it's very important. And so, um, like one example is I had to do independent research project to just get it out of the way for my major, and I decided to do it on tribal sovereignty and how tribal governments formed their own governments to reflect colonialism. Oh my God. And no political science professor didn't want to touch it because they had no education or they didn't know how to really talk about tribal sovereignty. So here I am, like running to like four different professors who are all well educated and they're all got degrees and PhDs in political science, but no one didn't want to touch it. And so I had to run to one of the few native professors on my college campus. And she taught English, so she didn't know what I was gonna do with my project. And so like every meeting it was just like her reminding, being like, oh, this is what I'll be doing and stuff like that. And she'll be suggesting um some tribes and stuff like that. But I did all the research on my own. And she was a great professor, but she was an English professor, so she had no clue how I was going to approach this as a political science student. So that's just one example of how it's very important to definitely teach these topics to non-Indigenous students because every Native American student at least knows what tribal sovereignty is from their own personal experience or their learned experience.
So, going off of that, do you think that it's important to have tribal sovereignty and tribal government history to be taught for political science majors or as a general curriculum for students, global understanding for all majors? Or do you think it should be, like more of a concentration interest for students?
I think so because when you go into college, I don't know if every state's like that, but I know when I first went to my college, I was required to take American government course, like that just taught you the basic levels of government. And Native American tribal sovereignty wasn't really taught that much, which was shocking to me because I was like, wait, you don't know these treaties that was created by the government. And so I feel like it's very important, and that's one thing that kind of encouraged me to continue my higher education and hopefully become a professor is to make sure students know tribal sovereignty. It's very important, especially if a lot of college students are choosing to be lawyers after their undergrad, so they can, and I don't really think that's really taught in law school unless you take a law course that focuses on tribal sovereignty or tribal Indian laws, for example. There are a few like programs out there that really teaches what solitary is, but not all like non-Indigenous students will not have interest in it. So I do think it's very important to at least teach a student, even though if it's like 3 days, like even like assign like a couple articles explain what tribal solitary is, and just have like a easy discussion in class with non-Indigenous students, being like, okay, what do you think about tribal solitary? Or did you know that da 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 da, like the OST government can choose like how many police officers they can have, or like whatever laws and stuff like that. So I do think it's very important.
Thank you. Next question. So, with your understanding of sovereignty and what you've shared thus far, how do you think we should be asserting ourselves as Indigenous people to achieve sovereignty? And could you also give examples of how sovereignty has been shown either in your community or globally?
Yeah, I think that tribal sovereignty it should be like natural to a lot of tribes. I know like there are some, oh my God, sorry, wait, the sun's coming. Um, I do think that tribal sovereignty should be natural to all indigenous people across the world. Like I was a political science international affairs major, so I always focus on indigenous communities in different countries and how like governments were treating them. And like example, New Zealand, they did not care that the Aboriginal people were there first. And even though they're like technically the first like official government to like ever apologize to indigenous people, but they still had the right. And at the time, the Aboriginals, they could have used tribal sovereignty, but I'm pretty sure it didn't exist back then. But that's one example that I would always like mention in my essays and bring it up and suggest like sometimes like political science is okay, like what would you suggest to this community and how they should be able to represent their human rights and stuff. And so I would mention tribal sovereignty as well. So I do think tribal sovereignty is very important, and all indigenous people should know and have the knowledge of that because it's very important. And especially in this time of age, we're going through a lot of changes. A lot of Native American study programs are trying to like not get their funding cut or not lose their students. So this is like very interesting time, and this is where we can use tribal sovereignty in modern day to protect our students, especially our youth who are like in preschool, kindergarten, high school. It's already affecting a lot of high schools, and they're slowly learning what tribal sovereignty is as well. And to be fair, it's not really taught to a lot of indigenous youth, and so they're learning about it in high school, and that's perfectly fine because that gives you enough time to decide what tribal sovereignty is to you and how your tribe uses it.
So, jumping off for the Indigenous youth, learning about sovereignty, and opening this up to anyone who's wanting to learn more about it or maybe wanting to become a political science major, and things like that. Is there anything that you wish you had learned growing up or would want to tell your younger self about tribal law and its distinctions within United States history?
I think I should have paid attention when I was younger because my mom used to go on and on about it. And as a kid, you don't really like pay attention to what adults are saying or what they care about. But also, tribal sovereignty was brought up by AIM too, and I'm an AIM baby, so like all my family members were all in AIM, or they were all at the protests at Winnie as well. And that I think that's when tribal sovereignty first came to public, was that moment where we did the Winnie takeover. And it's very interesting because like my brother is like 16 and he doesn't know about the history of AIM, even though like our whole family was involved in it. So my mom was very shocked too. And it shows like it's very important. And I think I should have paid attention more and just thinking like, oh, like, yeah, like everyone knows what tribal sovereignty is, which is not true. It's not really widely taught about unless you have a professor that's willing to go down that rabbit hole to teach their students. And so I think that's one thing I kind of regret is not really paying attention about what my elders or what my family members were teaching me about tribal sovereignty. And I used to just push it off and like, oh, like I don't need to learn about any of this. And now, like as a political science professor, oh, jeez, political science student who graduated, tribal sovereignty is very important, and it took me like literally 4 years of college to realize that while I was writing papers, doing undergrad research on it. It taught me the importance of it versus a 13-year-old who was just did not care about tribal sovereignty or how important it is to a lot of indigenous people. So I think that's one thing I feel like the youth should care more about is learning their own tribal sovereignty and how powerful it is and what you can do with it.
Yeah, I agree. Very powerful words right there. I think you're going to inspire a lot of youth here and anyone who wants to learn about sovereignty. Um, now that you just, shared what your thoughts on it. But that's all the questions that I have for you today, and I'm really thankful and honored that you came and talked with me today. So, thank you. If you reached the end of this podcast, I'd like to thank you for listening and hope you enjoyed our guest, Wicahpi, Chaddlesone, Yankton's thoughts on sovereignty. Hope to see you in the next episode. Toksha ake.